First off, I want to thank the brave men and women who work behind the wall. I want to thank them on a national level because their job goes unrecognized.
How do they try to turn a guard?
Well, correctional officer. Sorry, I apologize. But correctional officer.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi, host of Tier Talk. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Today's going to be a very interesting discussion. I think it's a discussion that's been a long time in the making. It's going to be custody talking to medical. We all know Russ Hamilton. Russ Hamilton's been on our show multiple times before. That's our custody background. Along with myself, I have a custody background. And right below is Connie Alleyne. She is our medical professional. She has a medical background. She'll give a little more of her career when we come back from our sponsor. But this is a conversation that is a must. For some reason today, it was getting recommended that we have a conversation like this. And I think what kind of opened up the chance for this dialogue is when we saw a nurse get caught up out of Missouri who wind up, looks like she killed her husband over an inmate. So, of course, we definitely got some interest in the medical side of things. But now the conversation that really should be happening that we want to have today is, how does custody work with medical? How does medical work with custody? Let's talk about the conflicts. Let's talk about working together as a team and just see what we can draw out of this conversation. So when we come back from our sponsors, we're going to dive into this great conversation. Hopefully we stay peaceful with each other, Russ, Connie, between medical and custody. I think it's going to be a great dialogue. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you brave men and women that work behind the wall. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell is going to notify you every time I post a video. Stand by for our sponsor. When we come back, custody and medical.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, guys, we're back. Okay, now this is going to be a very interesting dialogue. We should have had this dialogue a long time ago, so it's actually good to bring someone with Connie's perspective onto the show. Now, Connie, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience and just tell them a little bit about your history and also your civilian corrections academy? I want to hear a little bit more about that as well.
Sure. So I'm Connie Alleyne. I've been in for about 15 years now. I spent 10 years on Rikers Island and then 5 years in Connecticut Department of Corrections. First as a health services manager and then as a health services administrator. Pretty much fun. I sort of left the industry for a little while, but I think being away from the environment really puts things in perspective when you think about what could you have done differently or what you could have done better to be of support to the staff. So the Civilian Corrections Academy is something that just sort of came to me, that there's so many times that I've had to walk people out. You know, it's like one of the worst parts of your day or part of the job when you've got to literally walk people out of the facility because they've done something, they were inappropriate, there was undue familiarity that for some reason they didn't realize it was. And I think there's a lot of sort of borderline things that happen where the policies are open to interpretation to some extent, but having had those experiences, what I thought was, if civilians really had training that really met their need, right? Their one-on-one interactions with the inmates, how do they deal? How do they address? How do they address the inmates with confidence? How do they go to custody with confidence and say, hey, listen, this thing happened, I need help? Like, it's a rare instance that a civilian will just openly go and admit something happened and they need help to navigate the situation without fear of some sort of retribution. So I think this dialogue for me creates the opportunity or the platform for civilians to really understand that there can be a partnership with corrections and we can work together, but it's knowing how to do that. You know, sort of increasing those soft skills to be able to feel comfortable to say, hey, listen, I'm having a challenge, I need some support. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Well, so we're basically looking at some form of non-uniform staff training, and I'm sure Russ would agree that is very important because right now the number one concerns I know that custody has with civilian staff may be their mindset when it comes to security. Now, Russ, before you answer that question, just briefly a little bit about yourself, Russ.
Well, I have 27 years with California Department of Corrections. I eventually promoted to sergeant there. And then after my promotion to sergeant, I ended up retiring. And then I went back for another 2 years part-time as an officer because I just couldn't get enough of this great profession we're in. And then after that, I had an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a brand new juvenile department, and something that doesn't come along very often. And so I jumped at that opportunity because they didn't have anybody with any custody experience at that time. And so I was able to help bring that along, and I did that for a little over 2 years. And so then my time there unfortunately came to a close because they couldn't extend any more time to people who were in the retirement system, which was CalPERS there. And so I finally retired for good, and now I'm able to devote myself to content online and doing good training, and my new Facebook page, which is Keepers of Chaos, Chaos with K.
And you're almost at 1,000, by the way. I saw your numbers, 933. I just put 4 in right now. So
2 weeks, almost 1,000 members.
Yeah, that's pretty damn impressive. You know, the YouTube channel itself is around 6,852. So I know I'm getting some of that traffic from Keepers of Chaos. Now, Russ, I want to finish. There was a question I asked right before you introduced yourself, where we talked about what Connie's offering. Basically, it's, in my mind, a lot of it's also security training for civilian staff. How important do you think that training is, especially from your perspective as being an officer and a supervisor?
Well, you know, I think that her concept and what she's got going there is really, really super valid, and I think it's a great model to look at, because what I've tended to run into in my career is I would have you know, not just medical staff, but teachers and every other form of non-custody staff. Sometimes they get pushed to the wayside, and they're just not given enough heads up on what they should expect when they're confronting these inmates, because they're in there and they're seeing these inmates, and you know, depending on their raising, their bringing up, what they were exposed to, they are really out of their element in a way, and not being able to understand what the inmate is doing. Right off the bat, you know, inmates right off the bat are going to try and manipulate in every way they can. Now, some of that manipulation is low level. They're just trying to, you know, get an extra Advil or something like that. But it can also be to the other extreme, where they're hoping to be able to compromise an individual to get drugs or phones or whatever. And unfortunately, non-custody staff, because they haven't dealt with the law enforcement aspect of it, they can be left in the lurch because they don't understand what these things are that the inmates are doing. They're thrown into a completely unfamiliar situation and then being expected to function in it. And so, you know, any training we can do, I've over the years, I really tried to make an effort to put my best foot forward, especially when I found out some of the things that the medical staff were saying about me. They thought I was, you know, unapproachable, and they thought I was intimidating. And I said, whoa, you know, I got to stop you there, because I really want to do this. And I was really able to actually give them some good training and to bring them along and show them some things and stuff. And sometimes I forget that they don't understand where we're coming from. And so sometimes we have to be the one to, you know, to bridge that gap and say, hey, I don't know what you've been told or what you think you're seeing here, but we really want to be on the same team. And it doesn't always work that way, but I always have tried to strive to smooth things over and, you know, build those bridges, because those people can really help us out in a lot of ways we don't expect.
And, you know, Connie, your knowledge is obviously very well-rounded. Actually, I got a chance to meet Connie through a mutual friend of ours, Gary Cornelius, who you know is an author of many books, especially one of my favorites, Art of the Con. And he spends a lot of his time now after retirement teaching, going to colleges, So obviously when he drops a name my way, I try to connect with that person immediately. And since we've connected, you've been on my show a few times before. This is our first actual interview. The shows we've done before, just doing submission videos, and thankfully of what I requested, and I greatly appreciate that. And when you came up with this idea for the Civilian Corrections Academy, does part of that idea for training come with the relationship that you had with custody?
Absolutely. So I actually came into the system. I was really young. I knew nothing about nothing. And I actually encountered some really great officers that were like, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. You probably shouldn't say that. And so the informal mentoring was amazing because these are people who had already been on the job. They had already walked the walk, and I was just learning. And I think most importantly, it was probably because I was coachable. Many people walk in thinking like they know everything or they know how to handle themselves and they don't need help. And I think I was dumb enough to know like I really needed someone to like give me some insights that I just didn't have, you know. And I think that formally giving that to civilians really matters.
Right. And then I got to mention again, just kind of in partnership with what Russ was saying. Lost you for a second, Russ. Where are you going?
Sorry.
That's all right. Just kind of in partnership with Russ, and then obviously also what you're saying is we all know that we have to work together as one. I mean, that's how we get the mission done. That's why when Russ said, you know, I don't want to be seen as a guy that's unapproachable, because Russ knows at the end of the day, we need medical just as medical needs us. Now, some of the specific concerns that I had with medical, just in general, and it wasn't enough to always cause a divide because I always had a way of approaching people just to kind of understand where they're coming from. Because again, I don't try to point the fingers, because at the end of the day, it all comes to us anyway. We're one team. So a failure at any level it can destroy the safety at every level. So one of the concerns I used to have with medical, and again, by all means, if you had concerns with custody, I want you to say the same. Like, tell us what your concerns were. This is just an open dialogue, but I'm just going from my perspective, so maybe we could work a way to see things in the middle. But I used to always have a problem with the way they used to leave the needles. It was like a constant concern that, you know, we wind up having to get supervisors to, you know, take control of that. Now, even though medical, you know, technically in my mind, they should be in control of those needles. The partnership comes from custody, but custody isn't, in my mind, yeah, they're kind of like the final say so because they are custody, don't get me wrong, but we are dependent on medical to make sure that they do the right things with those needles.
So, I mean, I think, you know, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of stress on just counting your sharps. Everyone goes through the count sheet, make sure all the sharps are accounted for. I know that there was some changes with the sharps containers. I mean, I know that oftentimes when nurses are on the go, depending on where the treatment rooms are, depending on where the emergencies are, you know, things happen, I think, which are human error. But for something to be a daily practice with something as significant as a needle, you know, I can't imagine that would be a constant thing that's happening. But I do know that it's been an issue in different systems, and I know we've experienced it even. But it is, I think, the diligence of knowing that not only did we have the nurses do the sharp count, but we also had the oncoming nurse do a sharp count, and then the supervisor at the end, like the nursing supervisor at the end of the shift, was also responsible for a count. So we had multiple levels of accountability to make sure that sharps weren't being mismanaged.
Now, Russ, I mean, this is something that we would check every shift, at least that I'm aware of in the facilities that I worked in and also obviously interact with. We do count those sharps every shift. It looks like it's a supervisor that counts them from our end. But again, we do the secondary count. So basically, we're trusting medical that their count is correct. And then we kind of confirm that, okay, well, nurse Connie said there was 20 needles. I counted 20 needles or 20 sharps. Russ, I'm sure where you've worked, you did the sharp counts every shift?
Well, actually, the truth be it known, where I was at, we had nothing to do with any of the sharps counts themselves. That was was completely relied upon to be done by medical. So,
Really?
yeah, and it was, and believe me, it was an issue because they got beat, and none of their accounts ever showed that, because it was rare for them to ever actually do one. You know, they were just supposed to, you know, have direct, constant supervision, make sure the inmate dropped it in, and so inmates would sometimes, you know, beat them by dropping a piece of plastic in and palming it, and so it was something that we were completely not involved with in any way whatsoever, except when I would go out and I'd you know, find them in the housing unit cut down or something, you know.
Hey, Russ, I got to ask you, though, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, do you feel that there should be some level of custody involved in the counting of those sharps?
Yeah, you know, I think that what you need to have happen is you need to have some, you know, some sort of backup system, just so that, you know, you're double insulating yourselves from, you know, ending up with those things being out there, because, you know, it's a tremendous breach of security. Not just because the inmates are, you know, able to ingest drugs, but then you have to worry about staff being stuck by those needles and, you know, drinking antiviral cocktails and all the other nonsense that goes along with that. So yeah, it's definitely something I would like to have seen it ratcheted up. You know, it's one of those things that sometimes, depending on which facility, which department, you know, it can be you know, sent by the wayside, unfortunately.
And I also think it keeps the count honest. I mean, Connie, is that the system you worked with? Did you have a partnership with custody when it came to counting the sharps?
So no, we didn't. Typically what would happen is, after we do counts, there would be periodic like spot checks to see where we are and if they're on. But we also had a system where, if in fact your count was short, we actually went on lockdown for that until we could account for all sharps. And so that's never a fun activity. So there was a lot more pressure on the nurses to make sure those counts were accurate.
Who was doing the audit?
So the nursing supervisor would first do the audit, and then if there were any findings, then I was tasked with doing the audit to see where we might have tripped up or where there was something that was inconsistent. And then my dialogue was directly with the warden or the programs dep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just familiar with a system that's a little bit different. I'm familiar with a system that actually has a partnership between the supervisor and medical in regards to the sharps. Basically, supervisors are pretty well aware of what's going on at that moment with sharps and what's expected back. Hey, Connie, out of curiosity, how do sharps go missing?
So sometimes I think there's a miscount. There's times. So like a nurse knows she has, when she's going to go do sick call, for example, if she's going into a unit, she may say, okay, I've got 5 diabetics. She'll grab a handful and, you know, she may think she has 5, but she has 6. Or maybe she thinks she has 4 instead of 5. And she'll go to the unit, do all of her, you know, diabetic treatments. And then she's disposing of those with whatever container she takes with her. And so there's no way to double check what she just disposed of, because you can't reopen that sharps container once it's locked. So I can see that happening. Are there times where like an inmate might be in the treatment room and try to swipe one? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But it's very difficult to really figure out like what exactly happened when. It's easier to pinpoint like the shift. It happened on this shift. This was the nurse. This is where it went off. This is the person who was covering, you know, the treatment room on that particular day or time. But it's definitely difficult. It's really trying to find like that needle in a haystack.
Mm. And Russ, from your perspective, a missing needle, what does that do to the facility? What do you have to do for security reasons?
You know, on needles, I'll just say that once a needle was missing, it was such a big haystack. There was almost nothing we could do about that. Now, if it was something that could be used as an actual weapon, then we'd absolutely lock down and you know, start going dorm by dorm until we found it. But needles, not to me, but to the administration or the department or whatever, seemed much more like an afterthought. You know, it was a bad thing, but it wasn't that bad of a thing.
Well, see, for me, in my perspective, what I would do is if we get word that there is a missing sharp. Now, mind you, we're able to kind of pinpoint the time almost because we know the count each time the sharps are coming out. So if we notice that there's a missing sharp, the first thing we tend to do is we'll freeze the med line where it's at, you know, so there's nobody else going in or out. Try to control as much as we could. Usually the movements anyway are very controlled, unit by unit. So there should be a way that if, God forbid, a needle makes it out of that med area, you're able to kind of limit to where it can go. And then it's a matter of finding who was at the med line at that time, even go after the porters, whatever you can. But you have to make a good faith attempt. Just in case something happens, there has to be on some record that, you know, we search these possible areas, just paperwork-wise, just to make sure you're right. You may not be able to find it, but you do have to make that attempt because, you know, if you don't, there's a greater liability that you did nothing. So sometimes it's good just to make that attempt. And I'm not saying it's going to be a crazy lockdown. I never said that, but I do think there's going to be some controlled searches, if you will. What about when it comes to information that borders between safety and security and maybe HIPAA? Now, let me explain something on this, because when you deal with health administration, did you ever walk on the side of mental health as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Let's say that an inmate says something in confidence to the therapist, and what he said in confidence or what she says in confidence can jeopardize the safety of an individual or the safety of the facility itself. How do you know what can be reported and what shouldn't be reported?
So the way the policy is written, we were able to talk directly to the warden about things that we thought were of a security nature, because it pretty much says that he is the owner of like the records and or his designee. So there was a way that we kind of were able to talk freely with him, and whatever he chose to do with that information, he was able to do with it. But I mean, if it's something happening from a therapeutic perspective that they needed to address, it was relative to medication or anything like that, then yes, we did not discuss those things. But if it was something that we knew, you know, maybe the inmate said something about like a relative coming up and they were going to do something, that definitely was information that we brought forward to the warden, and whatever he chose to do or how he chose to respond was on him. But we did have an obligation to provide him with that information.
You know, with PREA coming into play now, I wonder if any of the facilities out there, and guys, comment below if you know or not, have any conflict between mental health and custody in regards to treating our transgender inmates. Because I know sometimes when the inmate may admit to, let's say, the therapist that, okay, I suffer from GID or gender identity disorder, sometimes the mental health doesn't want to tell either administration or any level of security, whatever it is, or classification may need to know, because of the way the inmate has to be classified twice a year, which limits the ability of the facility to protect the inmate. Is there anything in regards to transgender inmates, especially when they reveal it, that says for safety and security purposes that you have to tell administration or the PREA coordinator at the facility?
So from my end, what we do, we actually created sort of this PREA team where we had the mental health provider who went through the needs assessment or the checklist, the risk assessment, and they went through that directly with whoever the warden designated as the PREA coordinator for custody. And so there was a channel to have those discussions openly.
And there's never any kickback between mental health providing that information to that coordinator so they can act accordingly?
There hasn't been so far. I mean, who knows? Every time you turn, there's always a new situation that pops up.
But that's actually good to know. I'll be honest with you. It's good to know because that's actually a great way to start opening up that trusted communication. And hopefully the PREA coordinator does what they need to do to protect the inmate who is truly suffering from GID. Now, Russ, when you were involved in the field, PREA was kind of just starting to take its foothold, correct?
Yeah, actually, you know, a lot of places were doing a lot more with PREA at the time than CDCR was. And so, you know, I think we lagged behind in a lot of ways, especially with regard to the whole, you know, gender identity, dysphoria problems that were cropping up. So, you know, that's something that fortunately I didn't have to deal with much there. You did get a lot of training with it when I moved into the juvenile department, though, because PREA was a huge issue there.
Of course, very big with juveniles and obviously females. But obviously we still have it at the male facilities as well. Hey, Russ, did you ever have any issues with communication in regards to your relationship with medical? Like any concerns from a security standpoint that you felt that they just could not get a hold of?
Well, you know, there were you know, any number of instances, and I can give you, you know, a few of them. There were times where you know, we dealt with some nurses and stuff where it felt to me it was just like they just didn't get it, that these inmates they were seeing were dangerous. They didn't seem to take that seriously. And sometimes, you know, they would, you know, in our discussion and in our communication, you know, they'd be shooting back and say, well, you know, that guy, he's not a problem. He's not a problem. And for me to try and get in and say, you know what, he's not a problem right up into the point where he is. Sometimes they were loath to take that training that I was trying to give them and apply it because they didn't really see it. And then I'll never forget, we had our director of nursing. I ran into him one day. I was out in our little plaza area and I was processing evidence. And I said, hey, come over, I'll show you something real quick. And I showed him this, you know, this just huge shank that I had found. And he was really amazed. And he said, oh, wow, that's like 1 in a million. I said, no, that's like one of the 3 or 4 or 5 that I'll take off this yard this week. And he was taken aback. He had no idea the kind of environment he was in. But I'll hand it to him. What he started doing was every week he would send me an email and I'd send him back pictures of all of the phones, all of the drugs, all of the shanks that I found. And then he would take and disperse that to his people as a reminder to them of the environment that they were in. And I think it had a really good impact. I mean, I can't know for sure, but it did seem like that they started to take security a little more seriously, and they started to understand, you know, what we as officers go through and what we see that they often don't.
I'm going to tell you something right now. I like the fact that you encourage that communication between both parties, especially once that gentleman understood your perspective. It was great to see that dialogue continue, and it was great for him to be able to provide something to his staff just as a reminder of how dangerous the environment is. And I know Connie had mentioned it before that sometimes we forget that, you know, and I think we even forget that as custody. Hey, Connie, before we talk from your perspective, because I do want to get your concerns with custody, there is one last question that someone brought up to me a while back, and I do want to bring it up. Do you feel that civilian staff, now a lot of civilian staff, when they come into this profession, a lot of them have those college degrees, they're on that second level of education. And again, I'm not minimizing or, you know, say anything about our custody staff. I'm not doing that because obviously, you know, not everything you learn from the book. Obviously, there's a lot of experience that can really draw great knowledge. But do you feel that some of the civilian staff talk down to custody because they feel custody could be inferior in regards to that level of knowledge that they've attained?
Absolutely. I mean, I've witnessed it myself, and I've had to counsel people on it. I think that there's a way that some civilian employees may come into the environment and they can be very condescending. I mean, there's some that are just condescending in nature. Like some people have these crappy attitudes, and you know, professionalism is the expectation no matter what. But I also know that that sort of behavior doesn't allow for any open or honest dialogue with custody at all. And so it's just that constant reminder that, yes, you may have all these degrees and all that goodness. And I would never downplay that either, right? But I also think that there's a way that we respect what each person brings to the table and they're able to work with each other. And I think because there is some of that feeling that, you know, so for example, I had a doctor who was always condescending. It didn't matter who he spoke to. That was who he was. But it was even worse with custody. And so we ended up having to have the medical director come in and sit with him because it just was not a productive day for him ever, because people knew he was a jerk. So no one really wanted to work with him or support him. And he'd have a laundry list of inmates that he wanted to see. And no one was making any extra effort to get his people down because he was a jerk, right? And so what does it do when you have people come into the system and they are treating people some kind of way because they think they're above all of this, right? But you're in the environment and these are people you have to work with. So I just feel like at some point you have to get over whatever you think separates you from everybody else and realize that when we're behind the wall, we just depend on you guys to keep us safe. It's not a matter of you just deciding who you're going to be respectful to and who you're not.
And Russ, did you ever come across that where you felt that some of the civilian staff treated you as if you were less than what you were truly worth?
You know, I actually have one particular story, a little bit on the interesting side. I think we had the principal of the education department. They were having problems with inmates, you know, making it to class, and the teachers were writing these inmates up repeatedly and losing at the disciplinary hearing level. And I went in there and I talked to the principal. I said, you know what? I'll come in. I'll give your teachers a class on, you know, how to write these reports and make them stick. And I got that, you know, from it. I was like, you know, I don't think she understood that I was the guy that could make that happen. You know, get those people on board in a way that would make those disciplinaries stick and cause them to be able to ensure that the inmates got there. And, you know, sometimes, you know, it's just you're pulling your hair out, you know, because they have a teaching degree, you know, a teaching credential, maybe a master's degree, that they didn't need to be taught how to write a report by lowly Sergeant Hamilton, you know. But I always tried to reach out to him, you know, and I suppose that there were probably moments where I may have been a little bit recalcitrant toward them as well. But I always felt like, you know, I wanted to try and make things work. I wanted to try and give them the tools that they needed, because I was able to, I thought, you know, see where the need was and be able to address it. But, you know, sometimes,
it's funny.
Sometimes people won't accept.
Well, it's funny because sometimes it happens both ways too, because sometimes we look at our security concerns, the 101 stuff, and we expect civilians to know that. And I think we make these crazy assumptions that because we know it, everybody else should know it. And I think it can kind of go both ways, especially when, you know, we are so, you know, we deal with safety and security every day. So we expect the civilians to know this. And sometimes we get so upset so quickly because they forgot something that to us is 101. And at the end of the day, for them, it may not be. So I do think the communication, when it comes to kind of seeing each other in that inferior light, which we shouldn't do, does happen on both ends, because based on our experience and our expertise. And so in all fairness, Russ, I still would like to get Connie's perspective on some of the concerns that she gets when dealing with custody. So what are some of the concerns that your civilians have came up to you with when dealing with custody?
So one thing for certain is like the assumption that we know, right? A lot of times I think people forget that we aren't privy to a lot of information. Only certain levels of privy. So the warden may give me something that I might not necessarily be able to share with the rest of the staff. And so I think sometimes, so for example, you talked about how there are oftentimes like situations where like an inmate is really violent, but like the nurse was like running off at the mouth, like, oh, he's not that bad, until he's bad, right? So we don't typically know what the charges are and all that information to kind of have that as like a foundation to say, okay, there's a certain way I need to deal with this particular inmate because of his charges. So I think if there's this understanding maybe about just how much information civilians actually have about the inmates, I think that may change things a little bit. I mean, so for example, out on Rikers, I was able to access all inmate information. You could see what their charges were. You could see what classifications they were, housing, all that other stuff. Here in Connecticut, I didn't have that same access. So if there was a high-risk inmate that came in for whatever reason, we had like a high-risk meeting or an interdisciplinary meeting where we talked about this new inmate who was coming into the system. Here are all the things that he'd done in the past. Here are all the things we needed to be concerned about. And so, yes, we had information then, but it isn't always that we would know that this inmate really is a bad inmate. So I think sometimes the challenge we get is when we're talking with corrections and we're saying whatever we're saying, right? Oh, well, you know, I treat him every day, so I don't really see what's the big deal. I think those are those moments where like the officer or whomever that dialogue is happening could say, hey, listen, you know, like even if you pull the nurse aside or whoever it is that's being chatty and say, hey, so here's some things you probably need to know about this inmate. Because I think there is that assumption that you already know and you're making a poor decision based on all the information. And usually we don't have all the information.
Well, you know, recently we were discussing before the show, one of the concerns when we had a kind of a conflict between safety and security and medical was the shackling of pregnant inmates. Now, that's a hot topic right now. A lot of us are kind of on the fence with it. Believe it or not, a lot of custody people are on the fence with it too. It's not like it's 100% we all want to see a pregnant woman shackled, but if she brings something to that level where shackling is needed, I don't think custody is going to have a problem putting those shackles on. But Connie, I'm going to go to you first, and I definitely want to go to Russ on this. Are there any times where you think that safety and security and medical do conflict?
So I do honestly believe that pregnancy is one of the big ones. I honestly believe that there are certain points in a pregnancy, depending on the woman's, you know, stage, depending on all the other medical complications she may have, where shackling and handcuffing her just isn't appropriate because it could cause more harm to her just in general. I do understand the safety concern. I understand that there are policies and procedures in place with what you do in transport with someone who's pregnant versus not. But it's also this understanding that when many of the policies were written, it wasn't written in a way that was gender responsive because we didn't always have this very significant female population that we had to manage, you know, and I think there's a way that we have to be a little flexible in that understanding. And I just feel like the policy doesn't necessarily allow for that level of flexibility.
And I actually agree 100%. Obviously, with the growing numbers of females becoming incarcerated, obviously, I'm sure a lot of administrations going back looking at their policies to see if they can still be okay with cross-gender. And I agree. But Russ, if I don't know if you've ever worked with female inmates, but you know, if you saw that the female was acting out and being disruptive, I mean, at one point, would you be okay with putting those shackles back on?
Yeah, I think the problem sometimes with some of our policies is our policies tend to hit on the situations that we most encounter. Then we have an outlier event. We have perhaps a pregnant inmate that wants to hurt themselves. They want to run out into traffic. They want to jump off of a railing. They're suicidal. They're homicidal. They've got a bunch of problems, in the brain, and that tends to be something that's so far outside the norm that maybe policy really doesn't cover it. I think there's a point at which we also, though, we have to take into account humanity in some way, though, with an inmate that maybe doesn't necessarily need it. The problem is is trying to structure everything in a way where we can have black and white for every situation. I just don't know if that's possible. I think we need to have some flexibility in there to be able to move toward and prevent those outlier events where suddenly someone comes back and say, well, what were you guys thinking? I mean, this inmate, she wasn't shackled. She ran out in front of traffic, got hit by a car or whatever. And then we're trying to say, yeah, but our policy says, and no one's going to let us get off on what our policy says. So, it's a catch 22. It can be trying to craft good enough policy to an extent where you can cover every situation just doesn't work. We have to figure out everything in between and try and give it enough flexibility that good officers can look at it and make it work.
Yeah, there's some common sense discretion that obviously we may have to employ. I mean, there's a lot of times where you have those universal policies that may not apply to that specific concern. And again, you are expecting those on the scene to kind of adapt and adjust. And I understand that, but again, we try our best to bring things back to policy. I mean, that's the concern. So we may kind of maneuver a lot, but ultimately the end game is how do we bring back control and order? How do we bring things back to where it should be? But I wanted to make sure we covered this part a little bit, because probably we're going to have dialogue on this again in the future. But I want to ultimately ease the conflict that some of us have with custody and civilian staff or custody and medical. And I think as we discuss some of the concerns, we also discuss the middle ground, because I think those concerns, as we discuss what we see, I think anybody that's listening to this can start to see that other perspective. And I don't think that's given that much. Like, I think sometimes we get so myopic in our views that we forget that there's another perspective and another mission. But it doesn't mean that the mission is separate from our mission. Ultimately, it's to keep those inmates safe and secured, and that's obviously the same, no matter what department you're in. But in my opinion, and I'll go with Connie first, how important is teamwork between medical and custody, and just how important is it for us not to be isolated from each other?
It's absolutely essential. I mean, how many codes have there been that, medical is second on the scene and custody has already started CPR, and they've already stabilized the situation before medical got in there. And then you see how that works when it's like, okay, you're going to take over now, and this one is activating 911, and this one is doing their part. Like, I think when you start to see all those moving parts really start to work together, like, those codes go really smooth. No one ends up getting hurt as far as like staff. I mean, you can't control, whatever conflict already happened, and the situation has to get stabilized. But amongst the team itself, you see it. I mean, even when there's like inspections, the facility I was in was an accredited facility. So anytime we had OSHA coming, or we had the DEA coming, or anyone who was coming to the front door, we all worked together to make sure like the facility was in whatever condition it needed to be in, the inmates were where they needed to be, meds were being done properly. I mean, there were times where nurses doing, Medline, and she has to do a mouth check. And now we also implemented the officer doing another mouth check in case the inmate was able to cheek a med and the nurse didn't pick up on it. There was many times that the officer was able to see the inmate still had something in their cheek or under their tongue, even after the nurse had done the mouth check. So I just feel like there's so many different areas where we could be working better together and really keeping the facility safe together. I don't think there's any one way that the team can be disjointed and still work as a cohesive team.
Now, what's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Oh, I think that, teamwork is key, because really when we look at it, you have to be mission oriented. And by mission oriented, what I mean is everyone goes home safe at the end of the day. All the meds get passed out. The inmates get treated for this, that, and the other thing. You've made sure that the nurses, the teachers, the secretaries, whatever, have been trained in a way that helps keep them safe. And so sometimes, if you just keep in mind that, mission oriented is what will keep you moving forward in spite of perhaps, hopefully temporary personal conflicts. I'll raise my hand. I'll say I've been guilty of instigating, personal temporary conflicts because, medical staff or the other, they didn't see it my way. They've been guilty of it because I didn't see it their way. But I think at the end of the day, if we all come together and we try and resolve those things, then we're that much stronger. I haven't been perfect in my career, but I've always looked to get, past and beyond that to try and make it better.
Well, I gotta tell you something right now. When departments work together, administration, it's great. We just can kind of sit back and just, let it run like a machine. Unfortunately, when the departments don't work together, that's where you may start to see administration being forced to micromanage, because again, they got to do what's best for the facility, and sometimes they're being forced to make catch-22 decisions, all because, like you said, there could be that temporary personality conflict, when at the end of the day, damn well it's an easy solution, but they're just too resistant against each other to want to move forward. Now, in the future, we can't do it for today because this is going to be a whole nother show. I want to discuss medical assisted treatment, because I feel that has actually been a little bit of a conflict between custody and medical. But I don't think we're going to have time to touch on that today, because that's probably going to be in a show by itself, especially with the rise of Suboxone and other forms of MAT. I think Vivitrol is one as well. Yeah. But I do want to touch on one last thing before we go, and I think this is something custody would like to know, is sometimes we get assaults on staff in which the inmate may bite the officer or throw some form of liquid on the officer. And obviously, in the officers, or any staff member, but in the officer's attempt to try to find out what's actually been thrown on him and try to understand the inmate's medical history, so they kind of understand, like, what's on me or what can I get affected with, there becomes that little bit of a resistance from medical, obviously because of HIPAA, you can't divulge information to that officer. But you mentioned before the show that even your nurses, if they were attacked by an inmate, if they were bit, or if they had liquid thrown at them, they're not going to have access to that information either.
That's absolutely true. So essentially, HIPAA covers everything. And despite us being the providers, we can't just carte blanche review everyone's record just because. So a situation may have taken place, and the nurse can't just go access that record unless she's providing treatment to that particular inmate. Now, granted, she may know some information about that inmate because, there's X amount of inmates that are HIV positive. There are X amount of inmates. So, if he happens or she happens to fall into that category where you happen to just know that inmate, it. But the nurse can't just say, oh, I got a needle stick. I was just doing this person's meds over here. And so she's just going to go review his chart. It doesn't work that way. Pretty much the nursing supervisor steps in and will make sure, one, that all the policies are being followed. Here are all the precautionary measures that have to be taken. Here's what all the next steps are. If there's any workers' comp papers that have to get filled out for that, or FMLA and all the other goodness that all that goes into, because they're now going to have to be offline to go seek treatment if that's the case. But we can't just access. So the only thing that we kind of can do is, so the warden is kind of like the keeper of all the information in his house, right? And so if the warden is saying, I want this particular record for review, like, we can't say, no, you can't review it. We can't say, no, you can't have access. We can provide that information, and whatever he does with it is, his prerogative. But clearly, if someone gets bitten, we can't say, oh yeah, you definitely need to go get an HIV test, or you need to take some sort of prophylaxis so that you don't have a reaction to whatever it is the inmate might have. But I mean, we're all on the same page in that sense that someone has some sort of exposure at work. The last thing that we want is for us to have not taken any action. And while we can't just openly say this is what's going on with this inmate, we can say you might want to go check with your doctor and get, you know. And there's limits.
You know what, though? When I was out in Oklahoma, I went to go do an event for the National Medal of Honor for Corrections. I was out there with ACOIN and MCO, which is the Michigan Correctional Organization, and they were pushing they're trying to push for laws for liquid assaults, and I believe that they're one of the states that are leading the way, where if you throw liquid or bodily fluid at an officer or at a civilian staff member, you're looking at adding more time to your sentence, and hopefully the time runs consecutive. I don't know where they're at with that. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, they have the time running concurrent, which to me defeats the purpose. But they're also pushing for laws that say if the inmate decides to do that, then HIPAA is not going to apply. Because for the benefit of the person that was assaulted by you, the information is going to be readily available to that individual. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I mean, I can't imagine that, you know, I've now been victimized, and I'm going to be further victimized by a system that's going to protect the person who committed the assault. So at this point, like, I mean, yeah, clearly we all have rights to privacy, but I think at the end of the day, you can't expect that an inmate who is knowingly possibly exposing someone would be allowed to do it without any consequence.
And what's your thoughts on that, Russ? You think that's something obviously you should be in the know about, right? If you got assaulted or liquid thrown at you, you got bit, how bad do you want that information?
Fortunately, and this may have changed since my retirement or whatever, we had pretty good laws on the books for being able to go and take out a warrant to get a blood draw and to be able to review those records. I was involved in a couple of instances where that happened. Fortunately, we never had to resort to the warrant, but it's a pretty common and available tool that we could use to be able to do that. So, you know, that's something that we're able to look at and able to, you know, let the officer know that being able to know and be able to find out the person's HIV status, his, you know, hepatitis status, any other bloodborne pathogens right around the corner. It's, you know, just a question of getting the warrant.
And by the way, Connie, if I may, from a medical standpoint, when an officer or civilian staff member does get splashed by bodily fluid and they're going through these tests, how can that affect their personal life? What is it that they have to go through? What type of medication? I mean,
so it really depends on what the exposure was. I mean, there are some where you have to take medication for up to 6 months. I mean, working in the environment in of itself usually creates some tensions, I think, just in relationships in general. And then even worse, that you go to work and you get exposed and possibly bring whatever that exposure is back home to your family. You know, so we've had many times where we've had staff who just said, I can't work here anymore. You know, it's created too much stress at home, you know, having had the experience and then have a spouse who doesn't really understand the dynamics at play at work, which in of itself is another layer of stress, you know. But especially we've had nurses on the line who are pregnant, you know. In corrections, like, I think officers are usually taken off the line because they're expected to have physical contact with the inmates at some point in time. Whereas with the nursing staff, they're giving meds, they're providing treatment. And so they're usually allowed to continue to work and have inmate contact, although it might be limited. And so we've had, you know, a nurse get exposed. And of course, the panic is, what is this going to do to my baby? You know, and so we've looked at changing that process, maybe have her do desk duty or anything like that, just so that they're not in the space where they could be exposed. But the reality is that it has significant impact on whatever's going on in your home life.
Right. And I know for a fact, I've known a few officers who have to tell their significant other, and then obviously that limits the physical relationship that they can have with their loved one, if you will, at least for the 6 months or whatever it is. So it does take its toll. Now, one last thing, and then we'll bring it to a close, was one of the other questions I got way back when was how medical responds to injuries of staff on the job, whether staff was involved in the code or they just happened to get injured. What is the responsibility with the medical that's at the facility and their relationship with helping out custody or helping out civilian staffs outside of inmates?
So it really matters if, like, what that organizational structure is. So if the medical department works directly under the Department of Corrections, there may be no limitation to how they can intervene medically. But if it's a third party, there may be some legal liabilities or what have you at play that may tie the hands of the medical professionals. So at a minimum, they're able to stabilize whatever situation it is. And then that officer or the staff would have to go and seek, medical treatment outside of the facility. But if they're in fact, employees of the corrections department, then their intervention has no limit unless there's physical limitations. Like, so if, for example, the facility doesn't have the resources to stabilize that person in the moment, then they'd have to be sent outside. So it just depends on, I think, the organizational structure, how much you can and cannot do.
Yeah, and Russ, we were mentioning that before the show started. Like, so basically, if your facility has a contract vendor that serves as the health representative for, let's say, the inmates or whatever, just generally the facility itself, then most likely their response to staff outside of something emergent is going to be very limited. Like she said, maybe just to stabilize, but at that point we push them forward. But for the states that use medical that's state provided or whatnot, then they're liable, they're more likely to get more help. So I don't know how it is in California, but you guys have a vendor, right?
No, I mean, we had some vendors, but largely most of ours is rendered within house. So I never saw any problems with that. They always were willing to render aid, and up until the point. But at that point, you're always going out. You're either being stabilized and going out by state car. You're being stabilized and going out by ambulance. So I never saw any conflicts or anything like that with regard to it, because all of ours was provided directly by the state.
So that's kind of the difference that Connie just mentioned, though, right? So, Connie, you think that there are some that deal with those contract vendors that may have those problems?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just because, the vendor doesn't really know what is within their scope when it comes to, a colleague, right? So, because the other thing that comes into play is before you can render treatment, that colleague is going to have to give you some personal medical information. And so the lines get a little blurred when it comes to stuff like that. So if someone is exposed to something and we're in the facility, we decide to provide some treatment, and then there's a negative interaction between some med you might be taking that you didn't reveal to the civilian like the medical person on site, that creates a big liability. So I think unless it's a space where people feel comfortable to divulge any medical history, because before providing treatment, any true medical provider is going to want to get some background information on you to make sure that any intervention they provide will not have an adverse reaction on your body.
All right, so guys, before we come to a close, obviously we're going to have another dialogue, because obviously I want to talk about the medical assisted treatment, but I also want to talk about the difference between how custody relates to the inmate population and how civilians relate to the inmate population. I think that's another topic that can kind of stand on its own. This was just kind of just general topics just to get it out there. I think we covered a lot in generalities, but I think maybe what we could do next time is do more specific driven topics. And I think what we'll do is the MAT one, and then I would love to talk about the relationship differences between a civilian and an inmate and custody and an inmate and how that can conflict. We touched on it a little bit today, but I think that could be a conversation in itself as well. But do you guys want to say anything in closing? Connie, you have anything to say to our audience in closing?
Well, I'd just like to say it's great having these dialogues. I think that the more we talk about this stuff, I think it's the more that we can work closer together and really address some things before they become issues. But I think because oftentimes we avoid situations because the conversation might be difficult. We might be afraid we're going to hurt someone's feelings if we say something the wrong way, or if we seem insensitive to what someone else might, like someone else's perspective. But I think we continue to have these conversations so that, you know, whoever's watching knows that it's okay to talk about it.
And that's the key, right, Russ? What do you got to say for closing, Russ?
That's why I wanted to do this this particular segment, you know, move things forward, remind people what they need to do to stay on mission, and, you know, help bring us all into the right fold together.
And you know what's great about here, guys? We're all doing this on our own time. I mean, Connie's got the Civilian Corrections Academy going, and Russ got the Keepers of Chaos that he's building. So, I mean, this has become a mission for us. I mean, me with Tear Talk, trying to get the words out there. And I guess the mission is defined by the fact that we want to have our people safe. You know, you get that family in behind that wall, and you want to do what, you know, the best you can for them. So this is our chance to do that. And as I said, I believe we're a lot further than we used to be. I believe what we're doing now to build that teamwork is great, because what people don't realize is if custody and civilians truly got along, the power that we can have on laws, the power that we can have on just changes that are happening in corrections. Because as I said, I mean, the numbers would be so much greater. I just feel right now we're moving in an isolated fashion. So this is an effort to bring that together. So again, we're going to have future dialogue here. And don't forget, guys, go back to my video from a few days ago. We're accepting video submissions for how do you deal with stress on the job? That's the question. How do you deal with stress on the job? And we're accepting video submissions up until February 22nd, midnight. That's a Friday. So you're going to email me, GangiAnthony@yahoo.com, GangiAnthony@yahoo.com, the link. So what you're going to do is you're going to upload that video to YouTube unlisted, and then email me the link, and then I will take the link. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through the videos and then post a collection of those videos in one episode on Sunday. Because again, we're trying to make a voice for everyone. It's not just one voice, it's the voice of the many. So I think this is going to be fun, unique, and we're going to call this section Talking on the Tiers. So I like that title. I thought of it myself. All right. Well, I'm happy with it, damn it. All right. But as always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, again, the show is dedicated to you brave men and women that work behind that wall. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe, guys.